When your love gets strong, when your love it will break the fear. When your love gets wide, it will bring.
Here's an email from Danny. This is a Bigfoot story, and it's pretty good. At 2 a.m., every dog in the neighborhood was going crazy. My community is small and surrounded by woods, and we have coyotes, so I wasn't overly concerned. However, I was awake now and I wanted a cigarette. Plus, I wanted to check my own dog. He's a big boy and he can definitely take care of himself, but he's my baby, so I just wanted to make sure he was okay. I stepped outside and I lit my cigarette. I took a look around. He was definitely out of the gate. All the other dogs in the area were still losing their minds as I walked down the street to look for mine. I found him at the end of the main road, and I called him over to me and I hooked him to the leash I'd brought with. When we turned around and started heading back to my place, I noticed a figure on the other side of the street. It would have explained why the animals were all barking like crazy, but it was odd that this figure was about the size of a child. Sure, we have people walking up and down our streets all the time, even late at night, but we don't have any kids around, and if we did, it would have been strange to see one out this late. My dog lunged at the figure, and I had to hold tight to keep him from breaking loose. I realized just how angry the other dogs in the neighborhood were acting at this point. They were all leaping at their fences or pulling at their chains and snarling and barking like they wanted to fight. I had grabbed my spotlight so I could see everything clearly as this figure came within 6 feet of me. It wasn't paying me any mind as it walked, but I got a good view of it. This was no child. This was a Sasquatch. It may have been a small one, but fear welled up inside me as I thought to myself, there's probably bigger ones nearby. Well, it ignored me, and I was awkwardly trying to ignore it as it passed. I couldn't stop myself from turning around to get one more look at it, though, and to my utter shock and amazement, it slowly disappeared right in front of me. It was like it dissolved. There was no way it didn't see me, but it acted like I was never there. I didn't smell anything, and it never made any noise. All I really want to know now is if anyone else has a story of a Bigfoot disappearing right in front of them. I'd like to know that I'm not the only one. I bet there are stories out there of Bigfoot disappearing in front of people, Danny. This is quite interesting. I've heard of these stories where there's tracks in the snow and people follow, they look like Bigfoot tracks and people will follow them and they'll go out to the snow and then they just stop and there's nothing around. There's no place for this thing to have gone. The tracks in the snow just stop, like it just vanished or went straight up in the air. That's the only place it could go. This is a great story. I appreciate you sending it.
It will bring you there.
Hey y'all, welcome to the podcast. My name's Cameron Buckner, and on YouTube, this is the Dixiecryptid podcast or channel. Out on the podcast network on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, iHeart, anywhere you get your podcast, it is known as the What If It's True podcast. There's a lot of people moving over to listening to this stuff on that medium. On a podcast app, it uses a heck of a lot less battery and data on your phones. All you have to do is download Spotify, or if you have an iPhone and you have Apple Podcasts, it's already on your phone. Just open it up and do a search for What If It's True podcast. It'll be right at the top because it's becoming a fairly popular podcast and I love doing it that way. Anyway, thanks for joining me on this video. I really appreciate it. I have a few things to say and I'm sorry I haven't done this in a long time, but I haven't put up a video in maybe a week or two. I've been sick. I was sick all through Christmas. Family was here. I kind of acted like I wasn't sick, but I felt like crap. But I'm just now getting over it. This is December 27, and my voice is finally coming back, and I'm not sniffing and snuffling and blowing my nose. So I wanted to jump out here and record a podcast. I've got 4 stories in this podcast, and we'll just do the first 4. They're all really good stories. And then the last one is I've got 3 more audio files that I need to bring from the old What If It's True YouTube channel over to Dixie. So the last story will be something that was originally on the What If It's True YouTube channel. It's called Ghosts of the Colorado. It's a great story, but it'll be last, and you'll hear the title when we come up to it. Okay, enough yapping. Thanks for joining me. I hope you guys had a Merry Christmas, and I hope you're looking forward to a really good New Year and a great year in 2023. Let's roll into this podcast. All right, here we go. I live in a remote part of Virginia. Although events have made me question my love for hunting and the outdoors in general, I'm still a country boy at heart and a hay and cattle farmer by trade. I've never bothered telling anyone this story. No one would believe me. I thought sharing it here would get it out of my head once and for all. I guess I'm writing this for reasons of conscience and as a warning to my fellow hunters and outdoor enthusiasts. 3 years ago, a hunting buddy put in a good word for me, and I was voted into the local hunting club. I was excited to be able to step onto the club's land whenever I wanted. The club had 2 properties that they leased from year to year. One was a local piece of land with 200 acres, and it was loaded with deer and bear. The other property was a 45-minute drive over to Sperryville Mountain and is 1/3 the size. It's nicknamed the Orchard due to the fact that it was once a thriving apple orchard up until the early 1970s. Unfortunately, in recent years, Mother Nature had cursed the place. The sun only shines on the property a few hours a day. The beautiful and lush apple trees and scenic views are long gone. There's nothing there now except dead foliage and half-rotting trees. Vines have grown over everything, and if you're not careful, you can snag your clothing on a spiny thorn obscured by the underbrush. The only thing that offsets the ugliness is a beautiful freshwater stream that flows out of the national park that borders the place. It's not wildlife friendly. It doesn't attract many hunters, which is why I like it. I prefer stalking the grounds alone, without the bother of being elbow to elbow with other hunters. An elderly gentleman named Rob, who was one of the club's original members, took me under his wing early on. With his big belly and red cheeks and cascading white beard, he reminded me of a good old beer-guzzling Saint Nick. He was the lone dissenter whenever the idea of selling off the orchard was mooted during a meeting. He used to say to me, "Boy, don't let the others dissuade you. This place is right next to the park, and a monster could wander down at any time." I was able to harvest a buck each of the last 3 years there. Nothing huge, but something tasty for my wife and I to munch on during the off-season. Rob was right on that count, but maybe deer wasn't what he was referring to, as I would soon learn. It was a clear, cool, crisp day in November. I had just finished feeding the cattle for the final time that day, and I decided to load up my old Ford pickup with my ATV, my backpack, and my 6mm Remington hunting rifle for the drive over the mountain. I pulled into the lot on the side of the road. I offloaded the ATV and warmed it up, and then made the 20-minute drive to the tree stand. Sticks and rocks crackled under the weight of my ATV as I slowly drove up the rough old mountain trail, passing a dilapidated apple packing shed along the way. I had a good feeling in my gut that today would be the day that I'd finally land a monster trophy buck and prove to the other club members that the orchard was worth saving. I arrived at the stand and shut my engine off, and I looked around. and listened to the soft breeze stirring up leaves around me. Slipping my rifle from my shoulder with backpack in hand, I began quietly walking to the stand, trying my best to minimize the noise of the dead leaves crunching beneath my feet. I made my way slowly up the rusty ladder. I couldn't help but think about the massive 12-point buck Rob claimed to have once shot out of this very stand 20 years earlier. His words replayed in my mind. A monster could walk down any time. The hours wore on. The sky was growing dark. I always liked getting back to my truck before it got pitch black because it was an hour ride home and there was zero cell service. The possibility of having a vehicle breakdown in such a desolate part of the woods at night and not being able to summon help, well, that put me on edge. I reached down into my backpack and removed my lukewarm Mountain Dew. I took a sip and I glanced up toward the rocks in the distance. That's when I thought I saw antlers of a deer. Well, my heart was racing as I raised my rifle. Looking through my 3x9 scope, it appeared to be an 11 or 12-point buck. The animal made its way down slowly and carefully through the rocks until it was 150 yards away, and I had it in my sights as I tightened my grip on the rifle. Suddenly, it rose up from behind the rocks. I lowered the scope. This was no deer. It must have been 8 feet tall, with a skeletal build and a strip of brown fur running down the length of its spine. Its head was devoid of skin, like its skull had been run through a meat processor. Twin devil's horns protruded from above its eyes, and it was tearing apart a small animal with its front claws. Well, I watched in horrified fascination until it occurred to me that I was a sitting duck inside this deer stand. I eased down the ladder, and my rifle slung over my shoulder. A braver man might have taken a shot at this thing, but the smart money was on a fleet-footed human able to drive an ATV like a bat out of hell. And I backed away from the deer stand and started sprinting through the underbrush, the thorns slicing into my legs while I stifled the urge to vent my pain. My gun was bouncing uncomfortably against my back. I mounted the ATV and fired up the engine, and I put it in gear, but before I could accelerate, I felt something tug at my rifle. The beast had caught up to me, and its glowing eyes lit up by the brake lights. It was trying to pull me off, but I reached for the buckle on my rifle strap and flew out of there as the beast fell backward, gripping my gun. I heard it discharge, but I didn't look back. Once I passed the old apple packing shed, I knew I was safe. I ran the ATV behind some trees, and I leaped into my pickup truck, and I barreled down the mountain trail, and I didn't slow down until I hit the main road. A few days later, when I was checking the trail cameras that ring my property, I discovered something strange. I took my flashlight, and I walked out to the edge of the woods. Lying in the tall grass was the remains of my rifle. It had been broken in half. Not long after, I gave up my membership in the hunting club. We put our farm up for sale, and I moved out of the area. I'd heard my old buddy Rob had passed away, and the membership voted to sell the property where I had encountered this strange beast. Rob had no immediate family. A GoFundMe page had been established to help with his funeral expenses. His buddies buried him on the hunting grounds that he'd loved his whole life. His passing is marked by a headstone engraved with the legend, "A monster could wander down at any time." Okay, that's an unreal story. I thought it was a Bigfoot story at first, but I was obviously mistaken. You know what this sounds like? The description the guy gave? It sounds like a Wendigo. I remember reading D.A. Roberts' Curse of the Wendigo. It's on audiobook on this channel, by the way. You can look at the playlist and you can find it. And it's about a 6 or 8 hour audiobook. It's called Curse of the Wendigo. It's a codename Wild Hunt book. Anyway, D.A. did a lot of research into these Wendigos, and the way he described them is the same way this man is describing a Wendigo at this old hunting club. That's pretty amazing. Pretty amazing. All right, I appreciate the story. It was really cool. Okay, here's an unusual story from a woman. I think this happens in West Virginia. This is, you're going to like this. In 1968, when I was 7 years old, I traveled from Beckley with my mom, my older sister, and my infant brother to see my grandparents and other family members in West by God, Virginia. West by God, Virginia! Papa was a coal miner with black lung disease. He was in and out of the hospital all the time. When he was home, most of all my cousins would kind of avoid him. I guess it was a case of he needs his rest. But that didn't faze me. I'd barge in carrying a deck of cards and 2 little glasses of prune juice. I was the only one who would drink that vile-looking liquid with him. We'd clink our glasses together in a toast and slam it down before gagging a little and then breaking into laughter. Then we'd settle in for a game of Go Fish and try to see who was the funniest. We were great fans of each other. As soon as we arrived on this visit, I shot inside to see Pawpaw. Unfortunately, he was in the hospital, so I had to be placated with the knowledge that we'd be bringing him a plate of biscuits and gravy after supper that night. Meanwhile, I had to be satisfied with playing with my Johnny Lightning cards out on the front porch. I was out there playing and getting bored when I saw the abandoned house across the street, and inspiration struck. This place was falling apart. There were 2x4s angled in every direction that looked like perfect ramps to soar my cars off of. I was in heaven. I was busy ramping my cars off those boards and running them between the gaps when I looked up and I saw Pawpaw standing there. I knew I'd been busted. Turry. My name is Mary Teresa, but when I was only about a week old, Mama declared that I was no saint and said that I'd be called Terry, but it was pronounced Turry. You need to get home now, little miss, Pawpaw said. But Pawpaw, I said, it's boring over there. And then Pawpaw did the unprecedented. He raised his voice at me. At me. Terry, get your little butt home now. I would have gathered my cars, but Pawpaw took a half-hearted swing at my backside, something else he'd never done before. He didn't make contact, but it was enough to add a little extra giddy in my giddy-up. I ran back across the road, and I slumped down into the front steps, dejected and miserable. My shoulders were slumped, and my head was bent, and I was sure that Pawpaw hated me. And worst of all, I didn't understand why. When my mother and Mama came out on the porch and saw my tiny little self balled up and sad, they asked me what was wrong. Well, I began to relate the whole horrible story, but halfway through I burst into uncontrollable tears. Mom and Mama stared at each other over my head, and through their shock and bewilderment, they were loving on me and petting me and trying to make me feel better, but it wasn't working. As I sat there sobbing into my arms, a loud moan split the air, followed by cracks and a loud woof. That abandoned house across the street collapsed into a big heap. Now you may wonder why I can recall this story in such great detail. Well, it's easy. It was repeated at every family gathering every time we visited West by God, Virginia, until 1979, which was our last visit. But what I didn't know that day was that we'd travel there by train to attend my grandfather's funeral. Oh, that's a surprise ending. I remember thinking Pawpaw was in the hospital, but y'all were there he had already died, and he was there in that old house and getting on to you and telling you to get back home. You know what? He was trying to get you home so that house wouldn't cave in on you. Maybe some other people assumed that or kind of got that out of that story, but that is so interesting. That's kind of a ghost story, which I love ghost stories, and this was a good one. So thanks, Turry. That's the way I say Turry. Terrible. It's terrible. Turry, it's just terrible. All right. Good story, Turry. Thanks for sending it. Okay, this story is, it's probably about a skunk ape. I'm going to say this, and I've said it before, but I never attest to whether these stories are true or not, I'm not the judge. Who am I to say whether they're true or not? Somebody could have a really spectacular event in their life, and it could be real, and and then they've got people pointing fingers at them saying, "Oh, you're lying, you made that up." So I'm not the judge, I'm just the reader. And I look at them as if they're good stories or not, and I read probably 98% of every email that's sent to me, and this is one of them, and I'm not going to attest that it's true or not, but I'm sure enough going to read it to you, so hold on to your weaves. Let's see, the man, he doesn't give his name. I think I know his name from his email address, but I'm not going to say it. Here's what he writes. This is an encounter that I cannot explain. In fact, you could say that I have covered my tracks because there are those out there that live in fear of me revealing what I saw. My family has lived in Florida since the late 1940s when my grandfather retired from the Army Air Corps and built a great life for himself. He thrived in this particular area of the state with plenty of fishing and hunting. Now, years later, I'm 51 years old and I'm a married father to 3 boys. Like my grandfather, we too enjoy hunting and fishing. I'm a communications worker and I finally got a weekend off to enjoy some rest and relaxation at the family lake house. I was traveling east from Tampa Bay in my pickup truck, pulling my airboat. I decided to get fuel in Lithia, L-I-T-H-I-A, Lithia. I was 50 miles away from my destination. It was cloudy during the summertime storm and I took the back roads, which meant I lost only 30 minutes, making it a scenic drive. I felt the right rear tire on my boat trailer go off the shoulder, and I soon realized that I had had a blowout. I pulled over near the gate to a state park. Luckily, the lake house was only a few miles away. There was a large black SUV with tinted windows parked nearby, and I couldn't tell if it was occupied or not. As I changed my tire, a large man sporting a ponytail appeared behind my trailer. A second man, about my size, a little stocky but with a slight beer belly, emerged from the SUV and approached me. With my eye on the man still lurking behind my trailer, I asked if they needed some help. He told me that they had an airboat broken down on the lake's edge and had the parts to repair it, but they could use a lift. The man offered to pay me, but being a good guy and fellow boater, I refused his money. We were joined by a third man who was carrying twin duffel bags and a plastic tote. He threw everything into my truck, and I drove all of us to the nearest boat launch. Once we were in the water, I asked for a GPS location. The man with the beer belly said that he would direct me, adding that he knew the area, but there was a lot of swamp in the way, and that we'd have to run the sloughs near private property. We came upon a fence line where the man asked me to idle the boat. Then he asked the location of the pump house. Well, I pointed behind the tree line, although it occurred to me if he really knew the area, wouldn't he know where the pump house was? One of the others silently directed me to kill the engine. I began to think my good deed had put me in danger. There was no broke-down boat in sight. I was with 3 men whose manner suggested drug smuggling. I began to wonder if the duffel bags and the tote they'd brought aboard held some kind of illegal substance. One of the men pulled what looked like a drone from inside a plastic tote. There was a camera attached, and the man took a minute to adjust the monitor on his iPhone. The others unzipped the duffel bags and began putting together assault rifles. After the drone went airborne, they donned night vision goggles and slid into the shallow water one at a time, their weapons above their heads as they sloshed toward the shore. "What the hell's going on?" I hissed, trying to keep my voice low. "Is this legal?" "It's all good," he promised. "As soon as you hear me signal, crank up the engine and be ready to gun it out of here." Well, I was starting to panic. A few hours ago, I was just another weekend slacker with nothing but beer and fishing in my plans. And now, I was the getaway driver for a bunch of wannabe hitmen that, for all I knew, were committing murder somewhere out there in the dark near my lake house. Suddenly I heard something, and I looked up into the night sky and saw a fireball arc gracefully over my head and hit the water a few feet from the boat. I flashed my light toward the surface and saw what was left of a drone before its mangled propellers sank underwater. Then there were a series of automatic rifle bursts and men yelling. I heard tall grass rustling and tree branches breaking. "Hit the engine!" I heard the voice. Two of the men came into view and dove into the water as I cranked the engine. They scrambled onto the boat, but before I could ask about the third, I heard his screams coming from mid-air as he went flying 20 feet beyond us and hit the water with a mighty splash. "Leave him," said one of the men. "Get us out of here now." I pivoted the boat toward the man who was flailing in the water as if he couldn't swim, and I gripped his right arm to pull him aboard as he howled in pain. I realized his arm was broken. The others did help me get him into the boat. Something whizzed by my head and landed on the deck. It was an assault rifle, the muzzle bent like a pretzel. I piloted that boat like a madman until we reached the launch. The others climbed from the boat and they stumbled into the truck while I reloaded my boat onto my trailer. They didn't say a word as I drove them back to their SUV. "Let me help you wrap your buddy's arm," I offered. "We'll take care of him," snapped one of the men from the back seat as he helped his injured companion out of my truck into their vehicle. The last to exit opened the passenger door. "What I mentioned earlier, we need to settle up," he said. "Look, I don't need anything from you," I responded, thinking that this guy getting the hell out of my life would be payment enough. And suddenly his hand went for my throat. "Not a word of this to anyone," he said. Well, I stared long and hard at his face until he let me go, and he kept his eyes locked with mine as he climbed out of the truck, slamming the door with enough force to underscore his threat. From my rear view mirror, I watched him collect what was left of their supplies from the boat. He walked up to my back bumper, and he looked down, and he reeled off a series of numbers. It was my license plate. He winked at me and walked back to the SUV, and I watched their taillights fade into the night. It was unsettling. Instead of the lake house, I drove the 95 miles back home. I did what I was told, and I didn't tell a soul about that night. In general, I behaved as if in witness protection. It didn't stop me from thinking about what happened, though. With their beer bellies and ponytails, I suspected the three men were not part of any professional militia. At any rate, a good soldier would not leave a battle buddy to drown with a broken arm. Whatever they tussled with out there in the wilderness, it was savage enough to give them the beating of their lives, but human enough not to kill them. And that's the end of his email. Like I said, I don't claim these are true. I don't claim they're false. I just read them like I get them. This one was expertly edited. There was a lot of fluff in this story that really didn't really belong in the story. I hope the writer doesn't mind, but we cleaned it up a little bit, and it was good enough to do that. It was good enough to edit and get up on the channel. So you got to admit, that's a pretty good story, and it really makes you think. I'd like to, if this was fiction, I'd like to know who all these guys were and how they wound up there and what happened after, and all those things that go along with these good stories. But I guess we'll never know. So thank you for sending the story, sir. I thought it was good. Ghosts on the Colorado River. I was 16 when I had my first trip down the Colorado River. The river runs through the Grand Canyon between Arizona and Nevada, and in my humble opinion, is the best way to see the national park in all its God-intended beauty. The river is 250 miles of glorious water, desert, and red rock, a great place for a kid to make some good money and absolutely nowhere to spend it. I first started running the river as what they call a swamper. A swamper is someone who gets a free trip in exchange for working their way down the river and helping the river guides. This starts with a day-long process to inflate and rig a 2-ton boat and load it with enough provisions to last 18 people a full week of eating surf and turf most nights. That's a lot of heavy lifting, and I soon became popular due to my strong work ethic and my strong back. And like most 16-year-old boys back then, I was happiest when I was picking up something heavy and flexing for the girls. After the first trip, I was hooked. They soon gave me an actual job and I was promoted to a river guide in training. I started running as often as I could, gone for months at a time and making great money for a 16-year-old kid. By the end of the season, it was hard to put on a shirt and put away my sandals and go back to a boring high school life. A typical trip on the river was a week long. They were divided up into 2 parts, the upper and the lower. The upper group of passengers would go float for 4 days and then helicopter out. At the same time, a new group for the lower part of the river would helicopter in. The upper had the best rapids, but the lower had more intrigue, and I'll get to that later. Passengers were usually tourists from the big city who had never so much as set foot on a dirt trail or rock, let alone spent 4 days in the middle of a hot, stinking desert. And at times us guides would cringe as we watched them walk around like aliens on a new planet, just waiting for them to twist or break an ankle. The area is so remote that hikers regularly go missing and are never found again. I once even had a local pilot lean over to me in a quiet voice and say, "Hey, if you ever need to get rid of a body, just let me know. I know where we can drop it out of my plane. No one will ever find it." Needless to say, that left me speechless. I couldn't tell if he was kidding, and I wasn't about to dig in and find out. But I digress. We did our best to protect our passengers, but I don't think they realized just how dangerous the trip really was. Between massive rapids that can pin you against a boulder and drown you, the freezing water that can quickly put you into hypothermia, and the poisonous wildlife, it was pretty much like walking through a minefield. I knew guides that had found actual bodies floating in the river. They just fished them out, wrapped them in a tarp, and dropped them off at the next helipad. Now that I write that, I admit it sounds worse than it really is. One thing our passengers didn't realize is that once you start floating down the canyon, it's nearly impossible to get out. The river passes through some of the most remote areas of the country, with sheer canyon walls up to 4,000 feet high. There are very few trails up to the rim, and injured hikers or boaters typically die before they get help, or if they're lucky, someone calls a helicopter and they pluck them out of the canyon. That's not as easy as it sounds, because cell phones don't have a prayer of working here. In the old days, we had to wait for a commercial airliner to fly overhead and we'd contact them on the emergency radio channel. They would then radio the Park Service to arrange for a helicopter at a predetermined time and place. These days, satellite phones seem to work better, but even the narrow canyon walls can interfere with that signal. With all this said, the grandeur and the splendor of the canyon is worth all that risk. My personal favorite is the canyon walls in the morning light. It is nothing less than breathtaking. The beauty of this place still captivates me today and millions who visit. The river passes through Indian reservations, the Navajo, the Hopi, the Paiute, and the Wallapai, among others. This story is about a night we camped on the Wallapai side of the river. The trip had gone well up to this point, and we were at the end of a 4-day, and our passengers would be helicoptering out the next morning. The group was large enough that we had 2 boats to float the 30 passengers. These weren't the typical inflatable boats with oars. These are 30 foot long, and they sit 2 feet off the water. The design was originally used in World War II to support temporary bridges over the water. They have a metal frame inside and they weigh 2 tons empty. To manage this heavy boat, there's a 25 horsepower motor on the back. The engine is for some propulsion, but mostly for steering the beast through the massive rapids. While these boats are quite large, they don't even compare to the size of the rapids in the canyon. I've seen many disappear into the rapids and held my breath as I waited for them to exit. It was getting late on day 4. We began looking for a place to camp. We had lingered long enough at lunch than we should have, and the day was quickly getting away from us. We passed several other river trips. Each time we would pause and ask where they were going to camp, and we quickly found out that our options were limited. We would have to camp at a location that was less than ideal. The guide I was with was very disappointed and even seemed on edge about the campsite. I was surprised, given that he was a 20-year veteran who had seen it all, and I'd never seen him get agitated like that. The campsite was fine, but it was not great. It was rocky with limited space for that many people to place their cots. But that was okay. The passengers didn't know any different, and we were not about to tell them. A predominant feature of the site was a steep and rugged canyon up above it. To a 16-year-old, it looked like a nice adventure after dinner, if the light held. And after I finished cleaning up dinner, I told the guy that I was going to hike or climb up through the canyon. He strongly discouraged me, and he told me that there was a Wallapai Indian burial ground just up above. He simply but firmly said, "Trust me, you do not want to go up there." I have to pause and talk about the Wallapai. I've come across many Native Americans in the canyon and surrounding areas, and many are guides and really great people. The Wallapai in those days even used to run their own tours down the river, and they were always easy to get along with. But with that said, the history of the Wallapai is a bit more colorful. The way the legend goes, it is that during the Indian Wars in the mid to late 1800s, the Wallapai, like most tribes, pushed back hard against the United States cavalry. Tensions were high, and both began using unsavory tactics. At one point, the son of a Wallapai chief was kidnapped and held for ransom. For some reason, the negotiations went south, and his son was killed. Since that day, visitors began disappearing on the reservation and on the river running through it. Most attributed it to skinwalkers and the locals delving into black magic. I only made it halfway up the canyon before I got an odd feeling, like I shouldn't be there. That feeling, along with the fading light, made me quickly turn around. I didn't want to be up there in the dark with that I shouldn't be here feeling in my gut, and I quickly turned around and I returned to camp. I think the other guide was relieved to see me come back, and it wasn't until later that night that he told me the last guy that went up there couldn't shake a bad feeling for months. He was convinced that the spirits of the dead Wallapai were following him around. He was always looking over his shoulder, and he felt like he was being watched. As you can imagine, that didn't exactly make me feel any better, and soon after, we all decided to turn in for the night. What ensued was one of the most restless nights of my life. It all started shortly before I went to bed. Most of the guides slept on the boat. I was sleeping on the front of the boat nearest to the shore. I was woken up by the sound of footsteps in the water, and at first this wasn't a real concern. Periodically, we'd have a sleepless or drunk passenger walking around at night exploring or a little bit lost. However, when I shined my flashlight in the direction of the sound, I didn't see a thing. This pattern repeated itself all night long. I must have woken up at least every hour. It was just before dawn, as the first hint of light entered the canyon, that I was nearly shaken out of my cot. In fact, both boats were violently shaken to the point that we all nearly were thrown overboard. 2 boats, nearly 6 tons fully loaded, were shaken like a toy. We all jumped up and looked around. We looked to see if perhaps river debris had bumped into us or maybe something fell off the boat. But everything looked to be in order, and these were big boats that were hard to move. Maybe I was dreaming this. After the initial shock wore off, the sleep set in and everyone went back to bed. I couldn't sleep though. I'd been on edge all night, and now this happened. I sat there staring down into the brown cloudy water, and then I saw it. It was something just below the surface. It was blurry, but something was definitely there. I leaned in to try to help my eyes focus in the dim light, and as I stared into the water, it seemed to draw me in. Two dark spots slowly solidified to become eyes, piercing eyes that locked into mine. Not like looking at eyes in a picture, but eyes that moved to meet yours. Something with a consciousness, something almost like a new awareness came over me, like it had been there all along, but I hadn't seen it before. The nose and the mouth and the forehead and the chin all began to take shape. It was the face of an old Indian man with weathered skin and deep wrinkles. He wore a full headdress with feathers and beads. He appeared proud and defiant, almost royal. I was rattled by this revelation and shocked, and I jumped back. When I came back to look, he was gone. Over the course of the next 3 summers, I refused to camp at that site. Some of it was fear from my experience, but most of it was out of respect. My new respect for the dead of that place. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed that. If it was good enough, maybe give me a thumbs up. Maybe hit the subscribe button. I would just love you to come back and listen to the next podcast because I absolutely love doing this. These stories are fun. And whether you do or don't, I appreciate you anyway. So you guys have a good rest of your day, and I'll see you in a couple of days with another podcast. Sure appreciate you. See you next time.